Hi, I'm Dennis Hayes. Good morning. My charge here this morning was to tell you what keeps me awake at night, to give you reason for hope, and to give you a call to action. Part one is really, really easy. I've spent my life as an environmentalist. I have a congenital aversion to good news. My wife and I, when we were young, and she would continually come up at 2 o'clock in the morning and see me slaving away on something, came up with this term. I never quite understood why she called it this. It's probably something I should never disclose in public. I never have before, but she referred to it as midnight syphilis. That stuff that at 3 o'clock in the morning suddenly hits you, that something terrible might be out there, and that there's... In any case, one of the things that happens is you get up in the morning and it all looks much more solvable, and you realize that the fear was not misplaced, but manageable. So what are the kinds of things that keep me up? In 1979, I was running the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and a good friend named Steve Schneider was heading climate modeling for the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which was 15 miles away. We used to go out for long walks on the weekend, and in 1979, Stephen convinced me that something which prior to then had in my mind been fairly ambiguous. There were lots of claims about ice ball Earth, snowball Earth, about global cooling being a serious threat. That is now settled. The Earth is warming up. We've got a lot of things to still determine about the technicalities of speed and duration and where we will be, but global warming is real. It's 1979. In every way that you can think of that can be physically measured, in 2014 we are far worse off than we were in 1979. And a number of things that could have been solved pretty painlessly, pretty affordably, if we just kept on track with President Carter's 20% of the nation's energy from renewable energy and a super efficient economy by the year 2000 path. But as you know, we didn't. So keeping me up at night, within the last 2 months, 2 different studies using different methodologies, one of them published in Nature, one of them published in Science, one of them done by a team here in Seattle from the University of Washington, said that the dominoes have begun to flow on the West Antarctic ice field. This isn't something that's going to happen tomorrow or it's going to happen in 10 years, but it is now unavoidable. The things have started, and those geological processes will continue, those geophysical processes will continue, and we're going to be losing the West Antarctic ice field. And then a few weeks later, a separate independent study was saying that the conditions that were present on the Earth the last time that the Greenland ice fields basically all melted were comparable to those today, and are certainly comparable to those that are unavoidable given the lags in the climate system. Okay, just 3 marks in the last couple of months. Bill McKibben, if he wants to get you really depressed, can go into a litany of 50 of these kinds of things coming. But, you know, West Antarctic ice fields, penguins are cute, but is this a big deal? Yeah, it's a big deal. It's the loss of a decent fraction of Bangladesh. It's the loss of all the rice-producing river deltas of East Asia. And if we're talking about justice at a conference, those are not people who are in a good position to defend themselves. They don't have the economic resources, the legal resources, the political clout. And ultimately, it's going to be an inundation with climate refugees, a flood probably 100 times greater than left the Dust Bowl, and there's no California for them to go to. A tragedy that now is just unwinding. I wrote this book that Phil mentioned. I didn't even remember that he knew about it, on cows and their impact in the United States. If you look at the world and you care at all about the web of life, the different, as Paul Ehrlich was referring to, we're taking nuts and bolts out of an airplane and we're not sure exactly what holds the wings on and what holds the engines on, but we're taking these things that are going extinct and what is becoming an epidemic of extinction around the planet. If you look at people and our livestock and compare that to all wildlife on the planet, and you just weigh it, you put them on a scale, everything that is wild and terrestrial on land or in the air on one side of the scale, and human beings and our food animals on the other side, we and our domestic livestock now outweigh all wild creatures on the planet by a ratio of 28 to 1. We are literally squeezing the planet into extinction. And every time that we cut down some more forest, every time that we plow up some more prairie, that is going a little bit further. And as the population continues to grow, continues to want to eat higher on the food chain, it again is another one of these terrifying kinds of events that's unrolling. And then you can go into last night's news, the wars in the Middle East, cascading one against the other with degrees of barbarity that are just terrifying. No hands in my pockets today, I guess. Always reassuring when I can confirm that it really wasn't the NSA. Ebola breaking out in Africa. Now, probably more people have died in this epidemic of Ebola than have died in all previous epidemics of Ebola. And the virus appears to be mutating in ways that are always a little bit unpredictable. The great fear is, of course, that it becomes airborne and gets contagious like influenza. Likely? Probably not. Possible? Certainly. So I can go on and on and on what gets me up at 2 o'clock in the morning. What gives me hope? When I was the age of the young people in this room, I was clinging to the last shreds of hope. I mean, at a level that, candidly, I was trying to think of some reason not to commit suicide. I went off on a 3-year hitchhiking venture around the world because I was really unable to find much in the way of hope. In that era, it was the overlap of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union, the balance of terror between the two, the capability of killing all human beings on the planet dozens of times over and wiping out much of the rest of life on the planet as well. And it could be done through an electronic accident. It could be done because a madman was in charge of one or the other nation, which has happened in both cases, in my humble opinion. And then there was the civil rights era in the American South. Young people today have kind of forgotten what conditions were genuinely like back then, but appalling. I mean, it wasn't the rare maverick sheriff who was doing something illegal. It was enforced by the courts as a matter of law that people who were demonstrating for the right to vote, the right to sit at a lunch counter, the right to swim in the same pool as other people, to drink at a drinking fountain, to climb on a bus, would be attacked and beaten into submission with police stanchions and be tear gassed and have fire hoses put on them and be thrown in jail. Apartheid, we all remember with horror, but it was patterned on, literally built upon the model of segregation in the American South. Then there was a war in Vietnam, a war that I firmly believed we were on the wrong side of. And in fact, not so much even on the wrong side of, we were the wrong side of it. We got proxies in Vietnam to support us, but we were the principal folks that were, in my sense, fighting against some forces of history about national self-determination. And it went on and on. If the Ebola equivalent, it was polio when I was a kid. Everybody, my mother's greatest terror every time that I went out in the summer was that I would catch polio. And of course, we figured out ways past that. The likelihood of nuclear war today, of a full-scale thermonuclear exchange at least, is dramatically less than it was then. Civil rights still has an enormous distance to travel in the United States, but what was legally sanctioned then is not legally sanctioned anymore. You could not behave now without being put in prison for a very long time, the way that public officials would. And I wish that I had brought some slides because I've got some quotations from James Eastland that are the most despicable, racist rant that you can imagine, things that I can't really read comfortably in front of a mixed audience, an audience that has African Americans in it, because they are so awful. He was, for those of you too young to know, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the guy who decided about the enforcement of laws, the guy who decided who would be appointed to the federal judiciary, the guy with real power. That doesn't exist anymore. We've made enormous strides. The war in Vietnam was brought to an end, and now relations there are as they should be. Richard Nixon, for God's sakes, Richard Nixon, the ultimate Cold Warrior, opened up the doors to China. Polio is no longer a serious threat around the world. And thing after thing after thing, I couldn't imagine that there was any solution to when I was 19 years old and taking off on this have been solved. Now, I don't think that the world's future should hang by a leap of faith that we've cured all those things in the past, and hence we will be able to address all of the things in the future. But after you've seen things that are essentially unsolvable get solved, then it's pretty easy to summon up the determination to do whatever you can to solve the things that look unsolvable today. Then the call to action. I guess the most important things, and these are really to the young people in the audience, are two things. One, don't wait. I mean, it's hard to believe. Your lives are so damned full right now that you can't imagine that they would ever be more full. And how are you going to find time to go out to this demonstration? How are you going to find time to be engaged in this lobbying effort or to do whatever it is that you choose to do? Trust me, you will look back upon this period in your life when you're a little bit older as the freedom years. When you've got a spouse, maybe have a child, have a series of obligations in your job, it becomes increasingly difficult to do things. You still ought to be doing them. You still have to be doing them, but suddenly you're imperiling a bunch of things that you're not imperiling now. Great change around the world has almost always been led by students. I mean, the advance in civil rights led almost entirely by people who began in their early 20s. The bringing to a close of the war is done by people in their early 20s. And if you look at revolutions of all kinds, I don't just mean violent revolutions, but things that are transformational that have happened around the planet, that's just amazing because, and it was certainly true for me in the environment, one reason is you don't know what you can't do, right? So you go out and do it. In 1969, there was an effort to pass a Clean Air Act. It went absolutely nowhere. In 1970, we got a much tougher piece of legislation and got it introduced by a senator named Ed Muskie. This was a piece of legislation that it had the same kind of opposition from many of the same people that you see to climate bills today. It was opposed by the coal industry, by the oil industry, by the electric utility industry, by the automobile industry, by the steel industry. I mean, if you had money in America, you opposed the Clean Air Act. We had, at one time, the CEOs of the Big Four roaming the halls of Congress, Big Four, that I'm showing my age once again. We, at that time, had three major automobile companies. Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, was the CEO of something called American Motors, which no longer exists. In any case, the CEOs of the Big Four roaming the halls of the Senate, calling on every member of the relevant committee and telling them, if you pass this law, you will turn America into a third world country. It passed the Senate on a voice vote. It passed the House with 3 dissents. Something that was inconceivable in 1969 became unstoppable in 1970. And then there was this wave of legislation, the Clean Air Act, but also the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Superfund, RCRA, CERCLA, FIFRA. I mean, it was just, we were on an acronym kind of roll for a while there. And as a result of that rapid set of almost inconceivable changes, America entered onto a new glide path, and the economy has spent easily tens of trillions of dollars differently, more effectively, as a consequence of that rapid change. We have a bunch of needs now, and I should say that too was all driven by kids. The overwhelming kids. It was by people who were 30 and under. And then the final thought, I'm going on longer than I'd intended to, was be bold. You don't wait, and don't be afraid to reach much farther than you think you can. We're at a point right now where a number of these crises are not going to be solved with incremental steps. I'll just close with something that's a few blocks away from here that some of you saw. When we decided to build a green office, because we're an environmental foundation, and we were in an office where if somebody came and monitored our energy bills, we would have been a laughing stock. It was a wonderful old carriage house, but my office was a hayloft, and the hay never complained in the winter or in the summer, and as a consequence, it had no insulation, but it was on the historic register, so we couldn't change it in any fundamental way. So all we could do is leave that to somebody else and build something green. On the boldness front, we decided if you're going to do it, let's do it right. So we built a building that in the cloudiest major city in the contiguous 48 states generated 40% more electricity from sunbeams last year than it used for all purposes in a 6-story structure underneath. Remember, same roof, if it's 1 story, 6 stories, 40 stories. To get a 40% surplus in a 6-story building from sunbeams in Seattle. You can go someplace. And that captures all of the rainwater that falls on the roof and uses it as potable drinking water, and somehow managed to put 2 person years into discovering elements of a building. We have about 1,000 things in this building. We kept out of it 362 or 363 compounds that are toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic, endocrine disrupting, bad stuff for people, a couple dozen of them bad for tenants, all the rest of them bad for people somewhere in the chain that built the product. A great many of them for the people that would be building the building and spraying things on or painting things on. If we had built a LEED silver building, we would have passed any test of environmental responsibility. But instead, we built a building that last year used approximately 1/4 of the energy of a LEED platinum building. Be bold. Just set your sights on something that will fundamentally transform it, whether it's that you decide to plug into 350.org, which I would give big kudos to. Bill is one of my great heroes on the climate fight. Here locally, we've got Climate Solutions and the Sierra Club on Power Beyond Coal, trying to stop these huge exports from the terminals that are going to be set up on the West Coast. They need bodies, they need commitment, they need intelligent people who can be persuasive and move out into the community to change public attitudes on it. I'm hopeful about the future, but not because I've got any kind of an act of faith. I'm hopeful because rooms like this fill up with people like you who will go out and build a different future than the one we're presently heading toward. Thank you.